to the Klingon audio track. If you had not listened to the English audio track first, please switch over to that now. Thank you. We are now on episode 4, and I realized that for the previous 3 episodes, a lot of the discussions had leaned on the heavier side, with me talking about things like time and death and, just generally heavier topics. So I figured I'd lighten it up a bit and talk about helium. This is not a joke. I'm going to be talking about the element helium for the next however long this is going to be. Helium is awesome. It's just cool. It's the second element on the periodic table, and it is extremely versatile. It's light, so you can use it for things like balloons. I mean, that's where most people know helium from, but it has infinitely more uses than that. I mean, it is inert for one thing. So you could technically use something like hydrogen for those balloons, and it would be even lighter. You could make those balloons even lighter. They'd like float up faster and all that. There's just one problem with hydrogen though. Yeah, if you've ever like heard of the Hindenburg, yeah, that was a hydrogen airship. And yeah, it blew up because hydrogen is very flammable. I mean, hydrogen and oxygen is water. So actually, when you burn hydrogen, it just becomes water because it burns with oxygen. But this isn't a video about hydrogen. Hydrogen is pretty cool on its own, but helium is really cool. Helium is extremely inert. Like, it's very hard to get helium to do like anything. I mean, for hydrogen, you have like hydrogen bonds with a ton of stuff. You look at a ton of different elements and they just love to bond with things. Helium, though, it bonds with basically nothing. Like, it's just there. It's just helium, Helium is just helium. And interestingly, that's actually one of the reasons why there isn't that much helium on Earth. So, one of the problems with helium is that it is very abundant in the universe itself. I mean, it's the second element on the periodic table, but you can't really get a lot of helium because it doesn't bond with that much, like, at all. So the only like way you can get it is if it just gets trapped in gas pockets, or if it gets trapped without physically bonding with stuff. It gets trapped in like pores or like in gas pockets. And the problem is because it doesn't bond with anything and it stays so much lighter, it can just float away. It can just float away out into the upper atmosphere, and then it just gets taken away by the solar winds, and then you just don't have helium anymore. And that's why, like, despite helium being the second most abundant element in the universe, it's not super abundant on Earth. In fact, like, there are some problems in the fact that like helium isn't really renewable. Like, once you use it, it's just gone. It's a problem, and it's super duper a problem because helium is extremely useful. It has a ton of uses in science in particular. For example, you can use it to control an atmosphere because it's so inert. You can just take everything out. If you had something like hydrogen in there, hydrogen reacts with a bunch of different stuff. If you have oxygen, oxygen just loves reacting. Nitrogen is relatively inert as well, but it will even react as well with a bunch of stuff. So like helium is really the best thing to like put in there because it's so inert and just so not really like it's not going to cause any problems if you swap an atmosphere with helium. And that's better than just completely removing any atmosphere, because then you have a vacuum, and vacuums are harder to deal with, and technically it's like almost impossible to pull a proper like full vacuum. So you're always going to have stuff in there. So might as well have that stuff be inert. Sorry, Delilah's rubbing on the microphone, so if that is loud, I do apologize. It's also very, very useful in like for cooling, because you can use it has a very high thermal conductivity, so it can just be liquefied into liquid helium, and then you just run it through stuff, and that liquid helium is very cool, so it helps you cool things quickly. And that's actually very useful in a ton of different applications. So for example, with MRIs use helium cooling to cool themselves down, to cool the magnets and electronics down, to get them to an operating temperature so you can get like an MRI done. And without helium, you can't really do that because hydrogen just doesn't quite have the right like cooling properties, and it's just not as good, and it has like it's just not as good. Hydrogen you can run into some problems. It's also extremely like it just likes to leak, and if you have a hydrogen leak, yeah, once again, poof. You go up in a big ball of flames. And then, as mentioned before, of course, you have like flight. Flight. So for example, like the Hindenburg was used with hydrogen, and we all saw how that ended. So now a lot of uh, blimps, if you see a blimp, like the Goodyear blimp is the famous one that everyone knows. That one uses helium rather than hydrogen because it's inert. It's not going to spontaneously combust. Like it's just a lot safer. It's also highly useful in welding as well because, like I said, once again, it always comes back to like the inertness of helium. It doesn't want to react with anything. So if you're welding, you're working with very high temperatures, very like it just wants to react with everything. Like if you've ever welded, you know the moment you stop welding, you got to do something because it's gonna rust like immediately. That weld just wants to rust because it's hot and it was just like melted and it wants to react with the oxygen in the atmosphere. So you're just going to immediately start getting rust. But if you blast it with helium, it takes away all the atmosphere or it takes away all the oxygen, and you can just use normal stuff. Like you don't have to really worry about the rust while you're welding. It's super useful for stuff like arc welding, for example. And it's useful for so much stuff. I mean, you obviously know about like the balloons. You know that it makes your voice funny. Uh, it's also used on telescopes. Oh, superconductors as well use helium. There is just so much stuff, and it can be used like just in everything. Helium is cool. Helium is very cool. It's got a ton of great properties that make it awesome, and it's just an underrated element. And I do think it's interesting that like an element that is so useful and like it's so abundant in the universe, it's just kind of hard to find here on Earth, and it's in relatively low supply. Like there have been helium shortages in the past, and if we run into helium shortages now, like all those things I mentioned that helium can be used for, they're gonna have to find something else, or they're just going to have to find ways to like get more helium that it's or they just won't be able to work anymore. So like it's important to just acknowledge helium sometimes because it's cool. We like helium. Helium is fun. Well, I hope that was a lighter topic for the day. Yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your day. It's the end of the video. I know I've still got a bit of time left, but yeah, just bye bye. Oh, and episode 5 will be releasing March 13th at 5 p.m. Also, yes, that is Friday the 13th.